Hello scholars, and welcome to our next video on Wuthering Heights. Today we're going to be talking about chapters 15 through 18, and the first thing I want to point out is when Heathcliff comes to visit Kathy kind of on her deathbed. In this version on page 157, I just think it's hysterical that Catherine is so self-absorbed and kind of selfish and jealous and all these other things that one of the things she says to him is, how many years do you mean to live after I am gone? This is on page 157, and makes this reference that she would be jealous if he loved his future children more than he would love her. She says, speaking as though she was Heathcliff, I have loved many others since. My children are dearer to me than she was, and at death I shall not rejoice that I am going to her. So she's really like, almost trying to make him feel guilty about something like that as she's dying. The word wild comes up for her. There are some references on the next page about how she feels like she's enclosed here. I just wonder if there's any kind of interesting connection you can make with Catherine and her wildness, but also words like enclosed. Even her bed growing up was enclosed. She says on page 158, I shall not be at peace. So if you're doing anything with whether or not she's really a ghost when she visits Lockwood, she says right then and there, I am not going to be at peace. On page 159, in terms of animal imagery and Heathcliff as a non-human being, on 159, the narrator, Bronte writes that he gnashed at me and foamed like a mad dog, and the word creature is also used on page 159 to describe him, so that's something that you might want to track. He says on the bottom of 159, you have broken it, and in breaking it, you have broken mine, talking about the breaking of hearts. So there's just so much interesting in terms of the drama also that's taking place in this chapter. I just think Nellie is also hysterical here in kind of thinking the things that maybe I know some of my students have certainly thought about Catherine, and that's on page 161. She's fainted or dead, I thought. This is Nellie. So much the better. Far better that she should be dead than lingering a burden and a misery maker to all about her. So she literally thinks almost like the world would be better if Catherine would just die at this point. Calls her a misery maker. And we've talked a little bit about her toxicity and contamination, and here she literally makes misery. On page 162, this is the very beginning of chapter 16, Catherine and Edgar Linton's child is born. It's a girl. They do name her Catherine, but Edgar and everyone calls her Kathy, which Edgar never really called his wife. Heathcliff calls her that, though, which is interesting. On page 162, about 12 o'clock that night was born the Catherine you saw, meaning Lockwood, at Wuthering Heights. A puny 7-month child, and 2 hours after the mother died, having never recovered sufficient consciousness to miss Heathcliff or know Edgar. So Catherine dies after having her. The baby is 7 months old, so young, and I think when you think about the infant mortality rate at this time, I think it kind of shows that Kathy is very strong and hardy and a fighter, that she can survive even though her mother doesn't, and she's born 2 months early. Kind of sad. At the end of this paragraph, the narrator states, an unwelcomed infant it was, poor thing. It might have wailed out of life and nobody cared a morsel during those first hours of existence. We redeemed in the neglect afterwards, but its beginning was as friendless as its end is likely to be. And we do find out later that Edgar totally redeems himself and becomes this amazing father, but it's just kind of, I think, another example of, talking about misery making, Catherine, you never hear a word in her dialogue, anything about concern about her unborn child or the child that she's bringing into the world. As the reader, you barely know that she's even pregnant. You may have missed that one line. All she cares about is, Heathcliff and people who adore her and love her. So I think you could do a lot with motherhood here, too. How Nellie ends up stepping in as the surrogate mother to these children. But also, could Catherine have ever even really been a good or adequate mother? Something to kind of think about and maybe do something with when you analyze it. So when Nellie goes to visit Heathcliff when he's standing outside in the garden, She's, kind of terrified to tell him that Catherine has died. He already knows. He can tell from just watching in and listening. But on 165, he says, may she wake in torment, not there, not in heaven. Says, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. He's sort of invoking her spirit to haunt him. I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. And what's kind of odd, one of the more interesting descriptions of him as this non-human kind of thing is that he starts dashing his head against the tree trunk. And Bronte writes, not like a man, but like a savage beast. And there's splashes of blood, and Nellie can tell that this had been a repeated act, something he'd probably been doing that whole night, or at least until when he realized that Catherine had died. It's kind of like this self-flagellation thing. He's like literally banging his head against a tree until he's bleeding, kind of like that mad dog kind of description earlier. There's something very mad about it. On page 166, something that's interesting that happens here, and I would always love to have asked my students in class what they think about this action. So Heathcliff does get to see the body, Catherine's body. She had been on display, I don't know a better word, for viewing. She has a locket, and inside was a piece of, a curl of light hair, meaning Edgar's. Heathcliff had thrown it out, put in his own, and what Nellie does was let's see if I can find the exact line. On 166, I twisted the two and enclosed them together. I mean, I personally think it's fitting. Some might even say it should be Heathcliff's alone. I don't know, but that is what Nellie does. On the bottom of 166, I think is key, and that is that Linton makes the decision. Remember, he's the husband. He gets to decide this, and he makes the decision that she's going to be buried not in the Linton tomb, not in the churchyard, not under the, where the Lintons are buried in some kind of mausoleum or anything like that, but she's out free on the hills in the moor. Isabella comes back. We learn a lot about how she had been treated while she's with Heathcliff. There's so much, on 170 you can just see the word monster, devilish, all of this about him. And also violence. I had talked about violence with my class a little bit the last time that we met on Zoom. And on the bottom of 172, treachery and violence are a just return for treachery and violence, cried Hindley. And I do think it's a pretty violent chapter. And I think in particular, what propels Isabella to finally run away. There's a lot that happens there, but one thing that kind of struck me as extremely violent is Heathcliff throws a knife at her so close that he cuts her. And so I think that, do I think Heathcliff's an X-Men thrower of swords or, thrower of knives? No. He's like a child, so angry he has to lash out. And I do think that if you are looking, because we had studied in our class how the readers at the time the book came out were stunned by the violence, were almost disgusted by the violence, and there'd been a lot of verbal abuse and some mention of whippings, but I do think if you're doing anything with cruelty, in particular physical violence, this is the chapter to go. On 178, I think Isabella really gets to Heathcliff when she says, after all, it is preferable to be hated than loved by him, meaning Heathcliff. When I recollect how happy we were, how happy Catherine was before he came, I'm fit to curse the day. And you see that Heathcliff, the author writes, Bronte writes how his eyes rain down tears. So it's one of those moments where we really see that genuine response and emotion and reaction from Heathcliff. Where do I want to go next? Oh, on 180. This is that, if you have the same edition as me, this longer middle paragraph towards the end, but he was too good to be thoroughly unhappy long. This is talking about Edgar Linton and his daughter. He didn't pray for Catherine's soul to haunt him. Time brought resignation and a melancholy sweeter than common joy. He recalled her memory with ardent, tender love and hopeful aspiring to the better world. Where he doubted not, she was gone. and he's just such a great father. I think what's interesting is that Nellie asks on the next page on the top of 181, how could it be that Hindley and Edgar were so opposite in similar circumstances? Says that for Hindley, when his ship struck, the captain abandoned his post. Linton, on the contrary, displayed the true courage of a loyal and faithful soul. He trusted God, and God comforted him. I just think that I love Edgar. Maybe I should reserve, my true thoughts and emotions, but he's so admirable. So just keep your eyes on him as a dad. And Nellie even recognizes, he was sad for a couple days, but then he just becomes the best father ever to his child. Well, maybe, I guess you could still criticize him, and we'll talk about that later, but he loves her. He does not abandon his ship, to use that same kind of metaphor. Okay, oh gosh, so unfortunately Heathcliff ends up taking charge of Hareton. He kind of threatens Edgar and everybody that if he doesn't get to be in charge of Hareton once Hindley dies, and obviously Heathcliff ends up with Wuthering Heights because of Hindley's debts. But he kind of says, like, hey, I'm going to raise Hareton at this point forward. And by raise, I mean just let him live in the house, right? And he treats him as a servant, which is odd. They have a very complicated relationship, Heathcliff and Hareton. But he threatens essentially to then go after his own son, the son that Isabella is going to bear him, if he cannot take charge of Hareton. Nellie, coming back to Nellie at the very beginning of chapter 18, the last chapter we'll talk about today, she says that the 12 years, continued Mrs. Dean, Lockwood says, I should say, following that dismal period were the happiest of my life. So Nellie is extremely happy in this time with little Kathy and with Edgar. She has the Earnshaws, talking about the child, she has the Earnshaws' handsome dark eyes, but the Lintons' fair skin. She's the blend of them both. Edgar never spoke a harsh word to her. This is on page 185, and he took her education entirely on himself. The one thing that I think you could criticize Edgar, and we'll track this as we keep going, is that he is a bit overprotective. Protective in a way that maybe she's so sheltered that Kathy rebels in some ways, which we'll talk about. Okay. Other than the church, she has never even left the grounds of Wuthering Heights at this point. She mentions about, on page 187, talking about, let's see, how Mrs. Heathcliff and even her child have a delicate constitution. So Edgar gets word that his sister has died and he goes on the journey to go to fetch the child. He's gonna keep Heathcliff and Isabella's child if he can. But it's interesting to note that Isabella and her son are not really the strongest in terms of health, and Bronte's word is constitution. Okay. Kathy does, so talk about overprotective. She does, when Edgar Linton is gone to go fetch his nephew, Nellie's in charge of Kathy, and Kathy, she's intrigued. She wants to find this fairy cave. She wants to go off property, and Nellie ends up discovering her at Wuthering Heights. Luckily, Heathcliff is not home at the time. There's just a little beautiful image I want to mention on 189 when Nellie enters the Heights. I entered and beheld my stray lamb, interesting animal image, seated on the hearth, rocking herself in a little chair that had been her mother's when a child. I just think it's important to remember as you read this, the later chapters, that she is still Catherine's daughter, because sometimes we forget that and think that she's just Edgar's, because, well, in terms of when we study Freud, and we will talk about Nellie's role and Edgar's role in terms of the nurture versus nature relationship, but I do love that idea that not even knowing it, she ends up in her mother's chair. Hareton is there. There's a really awkward interaction between Hareton and Kathy that she can't believe this is her cousin. And there's also a lot with dogs here too, which is kind of quite interesting. But I would kind of want to end this video and this chapter with the idea that she's not so receptive to the idea that Hareton is her cousin. She thinks and talks to him at one point like he's a servant. But one thing that I think is really really important that I want to end on, and that's how do we judge Nellie as not just narrator, but also as a caregiver? And on the bottom of 194, something that has always struck me is that she asks Kathy not to tell her father that this has happened. Let's see, this is the very last chapter, very last paragraph of chapter 18. She did not comprehend it. In hard work, I had to obtain a promise that she would not lay the grievance before her father. I explained how he objected to the whole household at the Heights and how sorry he would be to find that she had been there. But I insisted most on the fact that if she revealed my negligence of his orders, he would perhaps be so angry that I should have to leave. Kathy couldn't bear that prospect. She pledged her word and kept it for my sake. After all, she was a sweet little girl. So I always love to talk to my class about what do we think about Nellie asking a child to keep a secret from her father, and also using guilt and manipulation, saying I could get fired and be asked to leave if your dad finds out. I think it's setting a really bad foundation of keeping things from her dad. Maybe this whole book would be different if Nellie had not done that. So keep tracking what you think about Nellie, not just as narrator, but also as the surrogate mother, caregiver, child rearer in this book. So we're going to stop there for today. Again, that takes us to the end of chapter 18. If you're using the same edition, that's page 194. And we'll pick up. We probably have at least 3 or so more videos to go to conclude this book. Thank you so much.